Conflicts ranging from the French Indian War in 1689 to the Battle of Horseshoe Bend in 1814 encompassed years of fighting between the European colonists from England, who founded Jamestown, Virginia on May 14, 1607, and the indigenous people who established their tribes on North American lands coming over the Bering Land Bridge millions of years earlier. As the Europeans and native populations continued to cause conflicts with one another, the colonists created their own government by separating from King George III's rule in England. George Washington was named the first president of the newly formed United States of America in 1789. Following the American Revolution, as the change in government from monarchical rule to a republican democracy took hold, a process of Indian regulation and removal through congressional action began with the establishment of the Indian Affairs Department in 1775 under the Second Continental Congress. Between 1802 and 1830, conflicts between Native Americans and the federal government escalated as a result of many wars between the native tribes and the federal militias. Ultimately, the United States government asserted their power. The Native Americans were suppressed by uncompromising treaties relating to removal from Indian territories and unattainable rights declared by President Andrew Jackson and the United States government. By 1830, the government created conflicts with the tribes by going against the congressional declarations, ruining chances for integration and compromise of Native Americans, and by forcing them to march across the United States, moving to uncompromising reservations full of miles of barren, desolate land. Treaties signed between the Native Americans and the United States government escalated the process of Indian removal and policies restricting trade and integration with indigenous people and the property they owned. Both the settlers and the Indians lived alongside each other in the New World and would live alongside each other for centuries to come. The Pilgrim-Wampanoag Peace Treaty was one of the first treaties between the government and the Native Americans in 1621 to create a peace pact that would last for over 50 years. This peace treaty was enacted as an ally agreement to do no harm to each other and to come to each other's aid in times of need. The Treaty of Greenville in 1795 was another treaty to constitute the end of an undeclared and multi-tribal war that began in the late 1700s. These treaties, along with acts like the Indian Trade and Intercourse Act in 1790, changed relations between the Native Americans and the United States government. Allied peace was established in the Pilgrim-Wampanoag Peace Treaty and the Greenville Treaty, then altered by the government, signing an act saying that no person shall be permitted to carry on any trade or intercourse with the Indian tribes. All of these treaties and congressional acts from 1621 to 1828, enacted before Andrew Jackson's presidency, led to an inevitable conclusion. Natives would be victims of the ever-growing power of the United States federal government. As a United States general, Andrew Jackson led numerous campaigns throughout his tenure raiding Indian property as early as 1813. In countless wars, including the Creek War in 1813 to 1814, Jackson believed that the rights under the Constitution of the United States were for white landowning families and excluded the native populations, who were reduced from 6 million to 600,000 by the 1800s. By 1830, there were only 440,000 natives left who had occupied their ancestral lands across North America, creating a unique culture and tradition. Seeing the westward expansion across the Mississippi River as a way to secure the nation's ideal of manifest destiny, Jackson created an Indian policy of forced removal as part of his campaign platform when he ran for president of the United States in 1828 and again in 1832. Changing the fate of countless natives' lives, Jackson's presidency took an uncompromising position toward the native tribes. Jackson's ideals and driving instinct to gain more territorial lands led to over 70 removal treaties signed from 1814 to 1837, most during Jackson's presidency. He single-handedly created a conflict with the native tribes that would lead to their forced removal to designated reservations in mostly uninhabitable lands across the United States, including lands in what today is known as Oklahoma, Missouri, Arkansas, and the Dakotas. In 1830, Congress declared that it shall and may be lawful for the President of the United States to cause so much of any territory belonging to the United States west of the river Mississippi, and to which the Indian title has been extinguished. Handing over congressional authority of the Indian issue to President Jackson set in motion the legal justification needed to forcibly remove tribes from lands west of the Mississippi, forever ending any hope of compromise between the federal government and tribal leaders. Under removal treaties such as the Seminole Removal Treaty in 1833 and the Treaty of New Ecota in 1835, property was exchanged and Indians were moved to new reservations. But many Cherokee, Choctaw, Creek, and Seminole tribes would not comply with the notion to move westward. Often, United States military intervention led to native destruction and forced relocations. In 1838, Indian removal reached a critical level as Jacksonian policies continued under President Martin Van Buren. 16,000 natives were forced to march the 1,200 miles to new, government-established reservations in Oklahoma. This event was known as the Trail of Tears. Promising protection in new land in Oklahoma sounded like a good compromise for natives leaving their ancestral homes. Routes for the Trail of Tears varied from the first water routes along the Tennessee, Mississippi, and Arkansas rivers to the northern route along land, even though it took longer. The Native Americans were promised financial help and materials on their travels and protection once they reached Oklahoma. But along the way, 4,000 natives died from cold, hunger, and disease experienced by crossing the rugged terrain of the North American interior. The Trail of the Exiles was a trail of death. They had to sleep in the wagons and on the ground without fire, and I have known as many as 22 of them to die in one night of pneumonia due to ill treatment, cold, and exposure. Private John G. Burnett. After bearing the journey that took over 2 months, the Cherokee, Choctaw, Creek, and Seminole tribes were relocated to reservations to rebuild a torn culture and population. Once tribes reached Oklahoma, there was no government support as promised. They were given desolate land and specific territorial lines. Oklahoma, meaning redskin, was designated as the main reservation area for the early removal processes. More reservations were established by the government in Tennessee and Missouri, but the land they left in the east was lost to the government. As American citizens started their westward expansion, Indian land kept being taken away by white settlers. The tribes came under federal jurisdiction of the government. Reservation life was hard for every Native American. They were the most impoverished racial group in the United States, comparing their living conditions to third world countries. Eventually, 326 Indian reservations emerged, despite the growth of the tribal nations. The federal government kept the Indians corralled within territory lines. The conflicts with the Indian Removal Acts in 1830 and the presidential power granted to Jackson by Congress caused uncompromising results. The forced relocation to reservations increased Native American resentment toward the federal government for harsh Indian policies. Between 1800 and 1830, the Indian population decreased from 600,000 to 440,000, as 26% of the native population died due to conflicts with the federal government. President Andrew Jackson left office in 1837, but that was not the end of the Indian conflicts with the federal government. The Seminole Wars from 1835 to 1843 continued the fighting for land in Florida. Many wars, battles, and massacres occurred, like the Sand Creek Massacre in 1864, where 700 members of the militia in Colorado attacked and slaughtered Cheyenne and Arapaho Indians. The Battle of Little Bighorn in 1876 and the Battle of Wounded Knee in 1890 were other key events showcasing the government's campaign against Native American tribes. The Indian Removal Acts in 1830 were the peak of the conflicts between the federal government and the tribes in the United States. In 1868, the 14th Amendment was passed, finally recognizing Native Americans as citizens and giving them the right to vote in United States elections. By 1860, 50% of the native population would meet the same fate as the 4,000 who died on the Trail of Tears. In 2015, the Obama administration changed the 37-year-old process that makes Native American tribes able to set up their own government, legal system, and taxes. The Indian Removal Act changed relations between the government and the Native Americans for centuries to come, forever decimating the Indian population, bringing to light the uncompromising power of the federal government.